A white millionaire named Henry humiliates a black woman, Gloria, at a luxury restaurant, loudly questioning her right to be there. But as the evening unfolds and he realizes who the person behind him is, it leaves him speechless. How will he handle the shocking revelation? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Henry Stanford leaned back in his plush leather chair, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. The glow of his computer screen reflected in his eyes as he hit the send button, sealing the deal that would add another million to his already impressive fortune. Another day, another victory, he muttered to himself, his voice dripping with self-satisfaction. Just then, a soft knock on his office door interrupted his moment of triumph. "Come in," Henry called out, his tone sharp and impatient. His assistant, Sarah, stepped in timidly. "Mr. Stanford, your colleague Mr. Johnson is here to see you." Henry waved his hand dismissively. "Fine, send him in." As Mr. Johnson entered, Henry barely looked up from his desk. "What is it, Johnson? I'm a busy man." Mr. Johnson cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, I wanted to remind you about the dinner tomorrow night at LeBlanc. It's that new 5-star restaurant downtown." Henry's eyes lit up with interest. "Ah, yes, the exclusive gathering. Who did you say would be there again?" "Well, sir," Mr. Johnson began, "there's talk that the CEO of Global Tech will be attending, along with several other potential partners for your expansion plans." A slow smile spread across Henry's face. "Perfect. This is exactly the opportunity I've been waiting for. Those fools won't know what hit them when I walk into that room." Mr. Johnson nodded hesitantly. "Yes, sir, it's certainly a great chance to make an impression." Henry stood up, straightening his designer suit. "An impression? Johnson, I'm going to do more than that. I'm going to show them why Henry Stanford is the name on everyone's lips in this city." As Mr. Johnson turned to leave, Henry called out, "Oh, and Johnson, make sure my car is waxed and detailed before tomorrow night. I want to arrive in style." "Of course, Mr. Stanford," Mr. Johnson replied, closing the door behind him. Left alone, Henry walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, gazing out at the city below. The lights twinkled like stars, and Henry felt a surge of pride. This was his kingdom, and tomorrow night he'd expand his reign even further. "Watch out, world," he whispered to his reflection in the glass. "Henry Stanford is coming for you." As the sun dipped below the city skyline, Gloria Thompson let out a deep sigh. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes scanning the now quiet office. The day had been long and challenging, filled with meetings and tough decisions. But that's what leadership was all about, she reminded herself. Gloria stood up, smoothing out her simple yet elegant dress. Despite her position as CEO, she never felt the need to flaunt her success. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. True power comes from lifting others up, not pushing them down. She grabbed her purse and headed for the elevator. As she passed by the cubicles, she noticed Maria, one of the janitors, starting her evening shift. "Good evening, Maria," Gloria called out with a warm smile. "How's your son doing in his new school?" Maria's face lit up. "Oh, Ms. Thompson, he's loving it. Thank you so much for your help with the scholarship." Gloria's heart swelled. This was why she did what she did. It wasn't about the money or the prestige. It was about making a difference, one person at a time. As she drove to LeBlanc, her favorite restaurant, Gloria reflected on the day's events. She had to make some tough calls, including turning down a lucrative deal that didn't align with her company's values. It wasn't easy, but she knew it was right. Entering the restaurant, Gloria was greeted by the maitre d' with a respectful nod. "Your usual table, Ms. Thompson." "Yes, thank you, Robert," she replied softly. Seated in a quiet corner, Gloria ordered her meal and took a moment to breathe. The stress of the day began to melt away as she sipped her water, her mind wandering to the importance of empathy and leadership. She thought about how understanding others, truly listening to their needs and concerns, had been the cornerstone of her success. It wasn't just about making smart business decisions. It was about making decisions that considered the human impact. Gloria's thoughts were interrupted as her phone buzzed with a message. It was from her assistant, reminding her about tomorrow's community outreach program. A smile tugged at her lips. Despite the challenges, she was grateful for the opportunity to make a positive impact in people's lives. Henry Stanford strode into LeBlanc, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. The soft lighting and elegant decor instantly made him feel at home. This was his world, a world of luxury and success. He breathed in deeply, savoring the aroma of expensive wines and gourmet dishes. As the maître d' led him to his table, Henry's eyes swept across the room. He nodded approvingly at the well-dressed patrons, feeling a sense of belonging among the city's elite. But then his gaze landed on a familiar face and his smile faltered. Gloria Thompson sat alone at a corner table, sipping water and looking lost in thought. Henry's jaw clenched involuntarily. What was she doing here? This was supposed to be his evening, his chance to network with the city's most influential people. He couldn't help but notice Gloria's simple dress and lack of flashy jewelry. In his mind, she didn't fit in with the upscale atmosphere of LeBlanc. Henry felt a surge of irritation, his lips curling into a slight sneer. As he settled into his seat, memories of a similar situation flooded back. It was at another high-end restaurant years ago, when he was just starting to taste success. He remembered seeing a man in a slightly worn suit, looking out of place among the well-heeled crowd. Henry had scoffed then, thinking the man must have wandered in by mistake. That memory only reinforced Henry's current feelings. Success should look a certain way, he thought. It should be polished, pristine, and powerful, just like him. Gloria's understated presence seemed to challenge that belief, and it made him uncomfortable. Henry tried to focus on the menu, but his eyes kept darting back to Gloria's table. He couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong here, in this temple of luxury and achievement. The irony of his thoughts never occurred to him, that perhaps it was his own prejudices that didn't belong in such a refined setting. Henry's irritation grew with each passing moment. He couldn't bear the sight of Gloria sitting there, seemingly oblivious to the exclusive nature of the restaurant. Unable to contain himself any longer, he raised his voice, making sure those around him could hear. "Can you believe they let just anyone in here these days?" Henry scoffed loudly, gesturing towards Gloria's table. "I mean, look at her. Does she even know what fork to use?" A few nearby diners turned their heads, curiosity piqued by Henry's outburst. Emboldened by the attention, he continued his tirade. "I bet she's here on some charity handout," he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Probably won some contest or something. There's no way she could afford a place like this on her own." Gloria, hearing every word, felt a deep ache in her chest. She recognized Henry immediately. His reputation preceded him. But rather than confront him or reveal her identity, she chose to remain silent. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass, willing herself to stay calm. Henry, oblivious to Gloria's true identity and growing more animated, stood up from his table. He pointed directly at Gloria, his face flushed with misplaced anger. "Hey you," he called out, causing several patrons to gasp at his rudeness. "This isn't some soup kitchen, you know. Places like this are for people who've earned their success." Gloria took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on her plate. She could feel the stares of other diners, a mix of pity and discomfort on their faces. Despite the humiliation burning in her cheeks, she maintained her composure, refusing to stoop to Henry's level. As Henry continued his verbal assault, the restaurant fell into an uncomfortable silence. Waiters hovered uncertainly, unsure how to handle the situation. Gloria sat there, enduring the barrage of insults, her heart heavy with disappointment, not for herself but for Henry and his narrow-minded views. The other diners in the restaurant exchanged uneasy glances, their forks hovering mid-air as they watched the scene unfold. No one dared to speak up, their silence only broken by the soft clink of silverware and Henry's harsh words. Gloria took another deep breath, her eyes fixed on her plate. She could feel the weight of the other patrons' stares, a mix of pity and discomfort etched on their faces. Despite the humiliation burning in her cheeks, she maintained her composure, refusing to stoop to Henry's level. As she carefully cut into her steak, Gloria's mind raced. She thought about all the times in her life when she'd faced prejudice and discrimination. Each instance had taught her valuable lessons about patience and dignity. Now those lessons were being put to the test. "Stay calm," Gloria whispered to herself, so softly that only she could hear. "This isn't about you. It's about him and his own issues." She took a small bite of her meal, chewing slowly as she considered her options. Part of her wanted to stand up and reveal her true identity, to see the shock on Henry's face when he realized his mistake. But Gloria knew that wouldn't solve anything in the long run. Instead, she reflected on the importance of empathy, even in the face of such blatant disrespect. She wondered what experiences had shaped Henry into the man he was today, what pain or insecurity might be driving his actions. As Henry's tirade continued, Gloria closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about her own journey to success, the obstacles she'd overcome, and the people who had believed in her along the way. A small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth as she remembered her mother's words. "Your character is defined by how you treat those who can do nothing for you." Opening her eyes, Gloria straightened her posture and continued her meal with quiet dignity. She knew that her response to this situation could have a lasting impact, not just on Henry, but on everyone watching. She considered how she might turn this ugly moment into an opportunity for growth and understanding. Henry turned back to his meal, a smug smile playing on his lips. He felt a sense of satisfaction, believing he had put Gloria in her place. The restaurant's soft lighting and elegant decor seemed to validate his actions, as if the very atmosphere agreed with his judgment. "Unbelievable how they allow just anyone in here nowadays," Henry muttered under his breath, stabbing at his filet mignon with more force than necessary. He glanced around the room, seeking approval from his fellow diners, but found only averted gazes and uncomfortable silence. Undeterred, Henry continued his meal, occasionally shaking his head and sighing dramatically. In his mind, he was doing everyone a favor by pointing out what he saw as an obvious mistake. The exclusive nature of the restaurant, he believed, should be protected at all costs. As he chewed, Henry's eyes darted around the room, taking in the other patrons. His gaze briefly landed on a man sitting quietly at a table behind him. The man seemed unremarkable to Henry, just another face in the crowd of elite diners. Henry dismissed him without a second thought, assuming he was simply another wealthy patron enjoying an evening out. Henry's attention returned to his own table, where he admired the fine china and crystal glasses. He ran his finger along the stem of his wine glass, savoring the feeling of belonging in such a prestigious establishment. The incident with Gloria had only served to reinforce his belief in his own superiority. "This is where I belong," Henry thought to himself, puffing out his chest slightly. "Among the best and brightest, not with people who don't understand the value of exclusivity." As he continued his meal, Henry occasionally glanced in Gloria's direction, each time feeling a renewed sense of irritation. Her quiet dignity in the face of his outburst only served to fuel his anger further. He couldn't understand why she hadn't left, why she insisted on staying and ruining his evening. Marcus Wells, the man sitting quietly behind Henry, carefully dabbed his napkin to his lips as he finished his meal. His keen ears had picked up every word of Henry's continued mutterings, and a deep furrow had formed between his brows. As the CEO of the company Henry hoped to partner with, Marcus had come to the restaurant tonight to observe Henry's character in a social setting. What he had witnessed left him deeply troubled. Marcus's gaze drifted to Gloria, who sat with quiet dignity despite the verbal assault she had endured. He had known Gloria for years and held her in the highest regard, both as a businesswoman and as a person of integrity. Seeing her treated so poorly stirred a protective instinct in him. With a soft sigh, Marcus pushed his chair back and stood up. He straightened his tie and brushed a hand over his salt and pepper hair. It was time to intervene, to address this situation head-on. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm as he approached Henry's table. "I couldn't help but overhear your comments about that lady over there." He gestured towards Gloria with a respectful nod. Henry looked up, surprise flashing across his face. He hadn't expected anyone to confront him, least of all this unassuming man he had barely noticed earlier. "I'm Marcus Wells," he continued, extending his hand, and I believe we have some business to discuss. But first, I'd like to talk about what I've witnessed here tonight." Henry's eyes widened as recognition dawned on him. This was the CEO he had been so eager to impress, the potential partner who could make or break his expansion plans. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead as he realized the gravity of the situation. Marcus pulled up a chair, his expression serious but not unkind. "Mr. Stanford, I think it's time we had a conversation about respect, judgment, and the true meaning of success." Henry's face flushed a deep red as Marcus introduced himself. The realization that he had been overheard by such an important figure made his stomach churn. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Marcus's voice was steady and calm as he continued. "Mr. Stanford, I believe there's someone you should meet." He turned and gestured towards Gloria's table. "Gloria, would you mind joining us for a moment?" Gloria rose gracefully from her seat and approached their table. Her composure was a stark contrast to Henry's visible discomfort. "Henry Stanford, I'd like you to meet Gloria Thompson," Marcus said, his tone carrying a hint of disappointment. "She's not only a regular patron of this fine establishment, but also the CEO of our sister company and a key advisor to both our organizations." Henry's jaw dropped. He felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath him. The woman he had so callously insulted was not only his equal, but potentially held more influence than he did in the business world. Gloria extended her hand, her expression neutral but her eyes reflecting a mix of disappointment and compassion. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person, Mr. Stanford," she said softly. Henry's hand trembled as he shook hers, shame washing over him in waves. He struggled to find words, his usual confidence shattered. I don't know what to say," he stammered. The other diners in the restaurant had fallen silent, all eyes now on the unfolding scene. The tension in the air was palpable, and everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus placed a hand on Henry's shoulder, his touch firm but not unkind. "I think, Mr. Stanford, that this is a moment for reflection. Your words and actions tonight have revealed much about your character, and not in the way you might have hoped." Henry nodded weakly, the full weight of his mistake crashing down upon him. He had let his arrogance and prejudice blind him, and now he was facing the consequences in the most public and humiliating way possible. Marcus turned to Henry, his eyes reflecting a mix of disappointment and concern. "Mr. Stanford, there's something else you should know about Ms. Thompson," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Gloria is not just a successful businesswoman, she's also one of the most respected philanthropists in our community." Henry's eyes widened, his face paling even further. He felt as if each word Marcus spoke was another blow to his already crumbling ego. "Gloria has dedicated a significant portion of her time and resources to various charitable causes," Marcus continued. "Her work has touched the lives of thousands, from funding educational programs for underprivileged children to supporting healthcare initiatives for those who can't afford proper medical care." Henry's gaze shifted to Gloria, who stood quietly, her composure unwavering. He saw her in a new light now, realizing the depth of character he had so carelessly dismissed. Marcus went on, his voice carrying a hint of admiration. "In fact, Gloria's philanthropic efforts have been instrumental in bridging gaps between corporations and communities. Her insights and connections are invaluable to any business looking to expand responsibly." The weight of Henry's mistake pressed down on him like a physical force. He had not only insulted a respected CEO, but also someone who held the key to the very business connections he had been so eager to make. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. His prejudice and arrogance had potentially cost him the opportunity he had been so looking forward to. Henry tried to speak, but words failed him. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He felt small, exposed, and utterly foolish. The other diners in the restaurant, who had been silent spectators to his earlier outburst, now watched with a mix of curiosity and secondhand embarrassment. As the reality of the situation sank in, Henry's shoulders slumped. He had come to this dinner full of confidence and ambition, ready to impress and make powerful connections. Now he stood humbled and shaken, facing the consequences of his own prejudiced assumptions. Gloria, having finished her meal, prepares to leave the restaurant. She turned again to face Marcus and Henry, her eyes filled with a quiet strength that seemed to command the room's attention. "Mr. Wells, it's good to see you," she said, her voice calm and measured. She then turned her gaze to Henry, who seemed to shrink under her steady look. "And Mr. Stanford, I believe I haven't been able to introduce myself fully." Henry's face flushed with shame as Gloria continued. "I knew who you were from the moment you walked in. Your reputation precedes you, both in business and other matters." The other diners watched in hushed silence, captivated by Gloria's poise in the face of Henry's earlier rudeness. "I chose not to confront you earlier," Gloria explained, her tone free of anger or resentment. "I believed it wouldn't have been fair to the other patrons to escalate the situation. They came here for a peaceful dinner, not a public spectacle." Henry's eyes darted around the room, acutely aware of the attention now focused on him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Gloria's composure stood in stark contrast to Henry's earlier behavior. Her dignified response highlighted the very qualities he had so carelessly dismissed: strength, grace, and consideration for others. "I hope," Gloria said softly, looking directly at Henry, "that this experience gives you pause for thought. Success isn't just about what we achieve for ourselves, but how we treat others along the way." With those words, Gloria gathered her purse and jacket. She nodded respectfully to Marcus and the other diners before making her way towards the exit. The click of her heels on the restaurant's polished floor seemed to echo in the stunned silence. As Gloria reached the door, she turned back one last time. Her eyes met Henry's, and for a moment, he saw not judgment, but a glimmer of hope. Hope that he might learn from this moment. Then, without another word, Gloria stepped out into the night, leaving Henry to reflect on his actions and the valuable lesson he had been taught. Henry sat in stunned silence, his mind reeling from the events that had just unfolded. The restaurant's soft ambient noise faded into the background as he replayed the scene over and over in his head. His face burned with shame and his stomach churned with the realization of his colossal mistake. He glanced around the room, noticing the other diners quickly averting their eyes. Their silent judgment weighed heavily on him. Henry Stanford, the man who prided himself on his business acumen and social standing, had just made a fool of himself in front of the very people he sought to impress. As the initial shock began to wear off, Henry's pride reared its ugly head. He clenched his fists under the table, anger bubbling up inside him. How dare they make him look so foolish? But even as these thoughts crossed his mind, a cold fear gripped his heart. The partnership he had been so eagerly anticipating now seemed to be slipping through his fingers. Marcus Wells, the CEO he had hoped to impress, had witnessed his appalling behavior firsthand. Henry's mind raced with the potential consequences. Would Marcus still consider working with him after this? The thought of losing such a crucial opportunity made Henry's palms sweat. He looked down at his half-eaten meal, no longer feeling hungry. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like a physical force, making it hard to breathe. Henry loosened his tie, feeling suffocated by the enormity of what he had done. For the first time in years, Henry felt truly lost. His usual confidence had deserted him, leaving him unsure of what to do next. Should he apologize? Try to salvage the situation somehow? Or was it already too late? As these questions swirled in his mind, Henry realized that the comfortable world he had built for himself was suddenly on shaky ground. The foundations of his success, which he had always attributed solely to his own efforts, now seemed flimsy and unreliable. Henry took a deep breath, straightening his tie and gathering what little courage he had left. With shaky legs, he stood up and made his way to Marcus's table. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the man who held the key to his future business prospects. "Mr. Wells," Henry said, his voice barely above a whisper. "May I have a word with you?" Marcus looked up from his dessert, his expression unreadable. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Please, sit down, Mr. Stanford." Henry lowered himself into the chair, feeling smaller than he ever had before. I want to apologize for my behavior earlier," he began, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I had no idea who Ms. Thompson was. It was completely unacceptable of me to speak that way about anyone, regardless of who they are." Marcus listened silently, his piercing gaze never leaving Henry's face. When Henry finished speaking, Marcus set down his spoon and folded his hands on the table. "Mr. Stanford," he said, his voice calm but firm, "while I appreciate your apology, I must emphasize that respect and empathy are critical in any partnership we might consider. It's not about knowing who someone is before deciding how to treat them. It's about treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their perceived status." Henry nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I understand, sir. I realize now that my behavior was inexcusable." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying Henry for a moment before speaking again. "I believe, Mr. Stanford, that you need to rethink your approach to both business and life. Success isn't just about making money or climbing social ladders. It's about the impact we have on others and the world around us." Henry listened, feeling a mix of shame and a strange sense of awakening. For the first time in years, he found himself truly hearing someone else's perspective. Henry trudged through the door of his penthouse apartment, his shoulders slumped under the weight of the evening's events. He tossed his keys onto the marble countertop and loosened his tie, feeling suffocated by more than just the silk fabric around his neck. As he poured himself a glass of scotch, his hands trembled slightly. Marcus's words echoed in his mind, refusing to be silenced. Henry walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the glittering city below. For the first time, the view didn't fill him with pride. Instead, he felt a gnawing emptiness. He took a sip of his drink, wincing at the burn. "Success isn't just about making money or climbing social ladders," he muttered to himself, repeating Marcus's words. The truth in them stung more than the alcohol. Henry's mind drifted back to other moments in his life when his arrogance had caused problems. He remembered the look of hurt on his assistant's face when he'd belittled her efforts on a project, the way his younger brother had stopped calling after Henry had mocked his lack of ambition for choosing to be a teacher. Each memory felt like a punch to the gut. Henry set down his glass and ran a hand through his hair, feeling a sense of unease creep over him. Had he been wrong all along? Was his entire approach to success built on a shaky foundation? He thought about Gloria Thompson, how composed she had remained in the face of his cruel words, and Marcus Wells, whose quiet authority commanded more respect than Henry's loud boasting ever had. For the first time in years, Henry felt uncertain. The possibility of losing the partnership loomed large, but something else nagged at him too. A sense that maybe, just maybe, he had been measuring success by the wrong standards all along. The next morning, Henry sat at his desk, staring blankly at the computer screen. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but his mind was far away, still trapped in the restaurant from the night before. The image of Gloria's composed face and Marcus's disappointed eyes haunted him. He rubbed his temples, trying to focus on the spreadsheet in front of him, but the numbers blurred together, meaningless in the face of his growing regret. The shame of his behavior weighed heavily on his shoulders, making it hard to concentrate on anything else. A soft knock on the door startled him. "Come in," he called, his voice lacking its usual confidence. Sarah, his assistant, poked her head in. "Mr. Stanford, I've got those reports you asked for," she said, stepping into the office. She placed a stack of folders on his desk, then paused, noticing his distracted state. "Is everything all right, sir?" Henry blinked, forcing himself to look at her. "What?" "Oh, yes, everything's fine," he said quickly, waving a hand dismissively. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they rang hollow. Sarah hesitated, concern evident in her eyes. "Are you sure? You seem a bit off today." For a moment, Henry considered telling her everything. The disastrous dinner, his shameful behavior, the potential loss of a crucial partnership. But his pride reared its head, unwilling to admit weakness. "I said I'm fine," he snapped, harsher than he intended. Sarah flinched slightly at his tone, and Henry felt a pang of guilt. It was the same look he'd seen on her face before, when he'd belittled her efforts. The memory only added to his growing discomfort. "Of course, sir. I'm sorry for prying," Sarah said softly, turning to leave. As the door closed behind her, Henry slumped in his chair, feeling worse than before. He knew he should apologize, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he turned back to his computer, determined to lose himself in work and avoid confronting the turmoil inside him. Henry sat at his desk, his fingers hovering over his phone. He knew he needed to call Gloria to apologize for his awful behavior, but the thought made his stomach churn. He had never been good at admitting he was wrong, and this time, he had really messed up. He took a deep breath and picked up the phone, then set it down again. What would he even say? "Sorry I was a jerk" didn't seem like enough. The image of Gloria's calm face as she left the restaurant flashed in his mind, making him feel even smaller. Henry stood up and paced his office, running his hands through his hair. He had to do this. It wasn't just about saving the partnership anymore. Something inside him had shifted, and he felt a genuine need to make things right. He walked back to his desk, and with shaky fingers, he wants to compose an apology to Gloria. Henry stared at his computer screen, the cursor blinking at the end of his carefully crafted email. He had spent the better part of an hour composing an apology to Gloria, pouring his heart into every word. But now, as he hovered over the send button, he couldn't bring himself to click it. The words on the screen seemed hollow and inadequate. How could a simple email convey the depth of his regret? Henry leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He had never felt so conflicted before. He read through the email once more, cringing at how formal and impersonal it sounded. "Dear Ms. Thompson, I sincerely apologize for my behavior." It felt like a business transaction, not a heartfelt apology. With a frustrated sigh, Henry deleted the entire email. He needed to do something more meaningful, something that showed he truly understood the gravity of his actions. But what? The thought of facing Gloria in person made his palms sweat. What if she rejected his apology outright? What if she laughed at him, or worse, looked at him with the same calm disappointment she had shown at the restaurant? Henry considered sending flowers with a handwritten note, but that felt too impersonal as well. He thought about asking Marcus to arrange a meeting, but the idea of involving a third party made him uncomfortable. As he wrestled with these thoughts, Henry realized that his fear of rejection was holding him back. He had always prided himself on his confidence, but now he felt small and vulnerable. The possibility of being judged for his actions weighed heavily on him. As the days passed, Henry's anxiety grew like a dark cloud over his usually confident demeanor. He found himself canceling meetings and declining invitations to social events, preferring the solitude of his office. The once bustling space now felt like a sanctuary, where he could hide from the world and the consequences of his actions. Henry sat at his desk, staring blankly at the wall. The ticking of the clock seemed to mock him, reminding him of every moment he wasted in indecision. His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, announcing another call from a business partner. "Tell them I'm in a meeting," Henry muttered, his voice lacking its usual authority. The weight of his unresolved situation with Gloria pressed down on him, making even the simplest tasks feel monumental. He picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he reached Gloria's name. His thumb hovered over the call button, but he couldn't bring himself to press it. With each passing day, the burden of his actions grew heavier. The memory of that night at the restaurant played on repeat in his mind, each replay more vivid and painful than the last. He could see the hurt in Gloria's eyes, the disappointment on Marcus's face, and the judgment from the other diners. Henry's usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by a paralyzing fear of confrontation. He found himself second-guessing every decision, wondering if his judgment had always been this flawed. The longer he delayed addressing the situation, the more insurmountable it seemed. His office, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a prison. The awards and accolades that lined his shelves seemed to mock him, reminders of a success built on arrogance and disregard for others. Henry realized that the longer he avoided facing his mistakes, the harder it would be to move forward and make things right. Henry took a deep breath as he stood outside Gloria's office building. His heart raced, and his palms felt clammy. He'd spent the entire morning rehearsing what he would say, but now, faced with the reality of the situation, all his carefully prepared words seemed to evaporate. "You can do this," he whispered to himself, straightening his tie and squaring his shoulders. With a trembling hand, he pushed open the glass doors and stepped into the lobby. The receptionist greeted him politely, and Henry felt a pang of guilt as he remembered how he might have treated someone in her position just a few weeks ago. He cleared his throat. "I'm Henry Stanford. I have an appointment with Gloria Thompson." As he rode the elevator to Gloria's floor, Henry's mind raced with doubts. What if she refused to see him? What if his apology made things worse? The doors opened, and he stepped out, his legs feeling like lead. Gloria's assistant looked up as Henry approached her desk. "Mr. Stanford, Ms. Thompson will see you now." She gestured towards a door, and Henry nodded, his mouth too dry to speak. He paused outside Gloria's office, his hand hovering over the doorknob. For a moment, he considered turning back, fleeing from this uncomfortable confrontation. But he knew he had to face this, to own up to his mistakes and try to make amends. With a deep breath, Henry knocked on the door. "Come in," came Gloria's calm voice from inside. Henry pushed open the door, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure Gloria could hear it. She sat behind her desk, her expression neutral as she watched him enter. The room felt impossibly large, and the short walk to her desk seemed to take an eternity. "Ms. Thompson," Henry began, his voice barely above a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Gloria nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. "Please have a seat, Mr. Stanford." As Henry lowered himself into the chair across from Gloria, he felt the full weight of his actions bearing down on him. This was his chance to make things right, to show that he understood the gravity of his behavior. He just hoped it wasn't too late. Henry sat across from Gloria, his hands fidgeting in his lap. The silence in the room felt deafening, broken only by the ticking of a clock on the wall. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Gloria watched him calmly, her expression neutral. She didn't rush him, allowing Henry the time he needed to gather his thoughts. "Ms. Thompson," Henry finally began, his voice shaky. I want to apologize for my behavior at the restaurant." He paused, swallowing hard. "What I did was inexcusable." Henry's eyes darted around the room, unable to meet Gloria's steady gaze. He took a deep breath and continued. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since that night. I realize now how wrong I was, not just in what I said, but in how I've been treating people in general." His words came out in a rush, as if he feared losing his nerve if he slowed down. "I've always prided myself on being self-made, on my success. But I see now that pride turned into arrogance, and I've been looking down on others without even realizing it." Henry's voice cracked slightly as he went on. "I have a lot to learn about respect and empathy. I've been so focused on climbing to the top that I forgot what it means to be a decent human being." He finally looked up, meeting Gloria's eyes. "I'm truly sorry for the pain and embarrassment I caused you. I know words aren't enough, but I want you to know that I'm committed to changing, to being better." Throughout Henry's stumbling apology, Gloria remained silent, her face a mask of composure. She listened intently, allowing Henry to express himself fully without interruption. Her calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to Henry's nervous energy, creating a palpable tension in the room. As Henry finished speaking, he let out a long, shaky breath. He waited anxiously for Gloria's response, the weight of his words hanging in the air between them. Gloria took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving Henry's face. When she spoke, her voice was firm but gentle. "Henry, I appreciate your apology. It takes courage to admit when we're wrong," she said. "But you must understand that words alone aren't enough. Real change comes from actions." Henry nodded, his shoulders slumping slightly. He knew she was right, but the truth stung nonetheless. Gloria continued. "The partnership is important, but it's on hold for now. We need to see genuine change in your behavior before we can move forward." Henry's heart sank. He had feared this outcome, but hearing it aloud made it all too real. I understand, he said softly. Is there anything I can do to prove myself? A thoughtful expression crossed Gloria's face. Actually, there is, she said. I support an orphanage downtown. They're always in need of volunteers. I think spending some time there might be eye-opening for you. Henry blinked in surprise. An orphanage? He asked, his voice uncertain. Gloria nodded. Yes. It's a chance for you to see firsthand the impact of discrimination and the importance of empathy. It won't be easy, but it could be a valuable experience. Henry hesitated. The idea of volunteering at an orphanage was far outside his comfort zone. But as he looked at Gloria's steady gaze, he realized this might be his only chance at redemption. Okay, he said finally. I'll do it. When do I start? A small smile touched Gloria's lips. I'll make the arrangements. Thank you for being willing to try, Henry. It's a good first step. As Henry left Gloria's office, he felt a mix of anxiety and determination. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew this was his opportunity to prove he could change. The weight of the task ahead felt daunting, but for the first time in a long while, Henry felt a glimmer of hope. Henry stepped into the orphanage, his designer shoes clicking against the worn linoleum floor. The smell of disinfectant and old books filled the air. Children's laughter echoed from a nearby room, but Henry felt anything but cheerful. Mr. Stanford? A kind-faced woman approached him. I'm Mrs. Baker, the head caretaker. We're so glad you're here to help. Henry nodded stiffly, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. Thank you. I'm, not sure where to start. Mrs. Baker smiled warmly. Let's introduce you to the children. They're always excited to meet new people. As they entered the playroom, a dozen pairs of eyes turned to Henry. The children ranged in age from toddlers to teenagers, their faces a mix of curiosity and wariness. Everyone, this is Mr. Stanford. He's here to volunteer with us, Mrs. Baker announced. A chorus of hellos filled the room, but Henry found himself at a loss for words. He looked at the children's worn clothes and tired eyes, feeling a pang of guilt for his own privileged life. Hi, he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. A little girl with braids tugged on his sleeve. Do you want to play blocks with me? Henry hesitated, unsure how to respond. He couldn't remember the last time he'd played with blocks, or with any child for that matter. I suppose I could, he said, lowering himself to the floor with awkward movements. As he sat among the children, Henry felt the weight of his past actions pressing down on him. How many times had he dismissed people like these kids, assuming they had nothing to offer? The realization made his chest tighten with shame. A boy with a scar on his cheek handed Henry a wooden block. You can put it on top, he said shyly. Henry took the block, his hands trembling slightly. As he placed it on the tower, he caught sight of his expensive watch. The contrast between his wealth and the children's modest surroundings had never felt more stark. Thank you, Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked around at the eager faces watching him, each child carrying a story he couldn't begin to imagine. For the first time in years, Henry Stanford felt truly humbled. As the days passed, Henry found himself spending more time at the orphanage. The initial discomfort began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of connection with the children. He watched in awe as they played, laughed, and supported each other despite their difficult circumstances. One afternoon, while helping with homework, Henry noticed a boy sitting alone in the corner. The child's dark eyes were filled with a wariness that seemed beyond his years. That's Malik, Mrs. Baker whispered. He's had a tough time trusting people. Maybe you could try talking to him? Henry nodded, feeling a flutter of nervousness in his stomach. As he approached Malik, the boy's eyes narrowed, reminding Henry of his own suspicious glances at those he deemed beneath him. Hello, Malik, Henry said softly. Would you like some help with your work? Malik shrugged, not meeting Henry's gaze. I can do it myself. Henry felt a pang of recognition. How many times had he dismissed offers of help, determined to prove he could succeed on his own? I'm sure you can, Henry replied. But sometimes it's nice to have company, even if you don't need help. Malik looked up, surprise flickering across his face. After a moment, he nodded, and Henry sat down beside him. As the days went by, Henry learned more about Malik's story. The boy had been shuffled between foster homes, facing discrimination and disappointment at every turn. His reluctance to trust wasn't just a choice, it was a survival mechanism. Henry found himself thinking of Malik long after he left the orphanage each day. The boy's resilience in the face of adversity was humbling. Henry realized that he had spent years judging people based on their circumstances, never considering the strength it took to survive in a world that often seemed stacked against them. One day, as Henry was leaving, Malik approached him with a small folded paper in his hand. "I made this for you," Malik said quietly, holding out the paper. Henry unfolded it to find a simple drawing of two stick figures, one tall, one short, holding hands. Beneath it, in wobbly letters, were the words, "Thank you for being my friend." Henry's attempts to bond with Malik continued over the next few weeks. He tried everything he could think of, offering to help with homework, bringing small treats, and even trying to engage in games. But each time, Malik's guard remained firmly in place. One afternoon, after another failed attempt to connect, Henry slumped into a chair in the orphanage's staff room. Mrs. Baker noticed his dejected expression and sat down beside him. "Don't give up, Henry," she said gently. "These things take time." Henry shook his head, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I'm just not cut out for this kind of thing." As he left the orphanage that day, Henry's mind was a whirlwind of doubts and regrets. He found himself thinking back to all the times he'd dismissed people, judged them without a second thought. The weight of those actions pressed down on him heavier than ever before. At home, Henry paced his living room, running his hands through his hair in frustration. He caught sight of himself in the mirror and paused, really looking at his reflection for the first time in weeks. The man staring back at him looked tired, uncertain, a far cry from the confident businessman he'd always prided himself on being. "Who am I?" Henry whispered to his reflection. "And how did I become this person?" He thought back to his childhood, to the struggles his family had faced. Somewhere along the way, he'd convinced himself that success meant leaving all that behind. But now, faced with Malik's quiet strength, Henry wondered if he'd been running from the wrong things all along. Sitting down heavily on his couch, Henry buried his face in his hands. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd spent years building walls around himself, just like Malik had. But while Malik's walls were for protection, Henry's had been to keep others out, to maintain his sense of superiority. One sunny afternoon, Henry arrived at the orphanage, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his ongoing struggle to connect. As he walked into the common room, he spotted Malik sitting alone by the window, his small frame silhouetted against the bright sunlight. Taking a deep breath, Henry approached the boy. "Mind if I sit with you?" he asked softly. Malik shrugged, his eyes never leaving the view outside. Henry settled into the chair next to him, unsure of what to say next. After a few moments of silence, Malik spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why do you keep trying?" Henry blinked, surprised by the question. I want to help," he stammered. Malik turned to face him, his young eyes filled with a wisdom beyond his years. "You don't know what it's like," he said, "to be judged before anyone even knows you." Henry felt a pang in his chest. "You're right," he admitted. "I don't. Can you tell me?" And so Malik began to share his story. He spoke of the cruel words thrown at him in school, the suspicious looks from strangers on the street, and the pain of feeling like he didn't belong anywhere. As Malik talked, Henry listened, really listened, for perhaps the first time in his life. "It's like being invisible and too visible at the same time," Malik explained, his voice trembling slightly. "People see what they want to see, not who I really am." Henry felt tears welling up in his eyes. The boy's words hit him like a tidal wave, washing away the last remnants of his arrogance. He saw himself in Malik's story, not as the victim, but as the perpetrator of such pain. "I'm so sorry, Malik," Henry whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I've been one of those people. I've judged others without knowing them, without even trying to understand. Malik looked at him, his eyes searching Henry's face. Why? He asked simply. Henry shook his head, feeling ashamed. I thought it made me better, stronger, but I was wrong. So wrong. As they sat there, the afternoon sun warming their faces, Henry felt something shift inside him. For the first time, he truly understood the impact of his actions, the ripple effect of prejudice and discrimination. He saw the pain he had caused, reflected in the eyes of this brave, resilient boy. As the days passed, Henry found himself becoming more involved in the daily life of the orphanage. He no longer felt like an outsider, awkwardly trying to fit in. Instead, he began to look forward to his time there, eager to see the children and help in any way he could. One morning, Henry arrived early to help with breakfast. As he stirred a large pot of oatmeal, he noticed a young girl struggling to reach the bowls on a high shelf. Without hesitation, he walked over and lifted her up so she could grab them. Thank you, Mr. Henry, she beamed, her gap-toothed smile warming his heart. Throughout the day, Henry found himself immersed in various activities. He helped with homework, played games in the yard, and even learned to braid hair from one of the older girls. Each interaction, no matter how small, seemed to chip away at the walls he had built around himself. During lunch, Henry sat with a group of children, listening intently as they shared their hopes and dreams. One boy wanted to be a doctor, another a teacher. Their enthusiasm was contagious, and Henry found himself genuinely invested in their aspirations. You know, he said, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice, I believe you can do anything you set your minds to. As the children's faces lit up with hope, Henry felt something shift inside him. He realized that these kids, despite their challenging circumstances, had so much to offer the world. Their resilience, their kindness, their unwavering optimism. It was all so inspiring. Later that afternoon, Henry found himself sitting with Malik again. This time, the silence between them felt comfortable, almost companionable. Mr. Henry, Malik said softly, do you think things can really change? Can people really learn to see past, the outside stuff? Henry looked at the boy, seeing not just Malik, but all the people he had misjudged in his life. He thought about his own journey, how his perspective had shifted so dramatically in such a short time. Yes, Malik, he replied, his voice filled with newfound conviction. I believe they can, because I'm learning to. Every day I'm here with you all. As Henry's time at the orphanage drew to a close, he found himself sitting on a bench in the playground, watching the children play. The sound of laughter filled the air, and he couldn't help but smile. It was hard to believe how much had changed in just a few short weeks. He thought back to his first day, how uncomfortable and out of place he had felt. Now, the orphanage felt like a second home. The children's faces were familiar, their stories etched in his heart. He had learned their names, their fears, their dreams. And in doing so, he had learned so much about himself. Henry's gaze fell on Malik, who was helping a younger child climb the monkey bars. The sight filled him with warmth. He remembered their first awkward interactions and marveled at how far they had come. Malik had taught him more about courage and resilience than any business deal ever could. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the playground, Henry felt a lump form in his throat. He realized how much he would miss this place, these children. The thought of leaving made his heart ache in a way he had never experienced before. But along with the sadness, there was something else, a profound sense of gratitude. This experience had changed him in ways he never thought possible. He had come here thinking he was doing these children a favor, but in reality, they had given him so much more. Henry stood up, brushing off his pants. As he walked towards the building, he made a silent promise to himself. This wouldn't be the end. He would find ways to stay involved, to continue making a difference in these children's lives. For the first time in his life, Henry felt truly humble. He realized that his success in business meant little if he couldn't use it to help others. The arrogance that had once defined him seemed to have melted away, and replaced by a genuine desire to understand and connect with people from all walks of life. Henry stood outside Gloria's office, taking a deep breath to steady his nerves. This time, as he knocked on her door, he felt different, humbled, yet purposeful. When Gloria called for him to enter, he stepped inside with a newfound confidence. Gloria looked up from her desk, her eyes meeting Henry's. She noticed immediately that something had changed in him. The arrogance that once radiated from his very being was gone, replaced by a quiet strength. "Ms. Thompson," Henry began, his voice soft but clear. "I wanted to thank you for giving me the opportunity to volunteer at the orphanage. It's been, well, life-changing." Gloria nodded, gesturing for Henry to take a seat. She remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I've learned so much," Henry went on, his eyes brimming with emotion. "Those children, they've taught me more about resilience, kindness, and the true meaning of success than I ever could have imagined." As Henry spoke, Gloria listened intently. She could hear the sincerity in his voice, see the genuine change in his demeanor. It was as if the man sitting before her was an entirely different person from the one who had caused a scene in the restaurant weeks ago. "I realize now how narrow my view of the world was," Henry admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "I judged people based on such superficial things. But those kids, they showed me what really matters." Gloria leaned forward, her expression softening. "Can you tell me more about your experience, Henry? What specifically did you learn?" Henry's face lit up as he began to share stories about the children he had met, especially Malik. He spoke about the challenges they faced, their dreams, and how they had opened his eyes to the realities of discrimination and hardship. As Gloria listened, she couldn't help but feel impressed. The change in Henry was palpable. His words were no longer filled with self-importance, but with genuine empathy and understanding. Gloria listened intently as Henry finished sharing his experiences. She could see the genuine transformation in him, and it touched her heart. After a moment of thoughtful silence, she spoke. "Henry, I'm truly impressed by the change I see in you," Gloria said, her voice warm and sincere. "It takes a lot of courage to confront our own biases and work to overcome them." Henry nodded, feeling a mix of relief and gratitude wash over him. "Thank you, Ms. Thompson. I can't express how much this experience has meant to me." Gloria leaned back in her chair, a small smile playing on her lips. "I believe you've learned a valuable lesson, Henry. One that will serve you well in both your personal and professional life." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "I think we can move forward with the partnership," Gloria said, causing Henry's eyes to widen with surprise and hope. "Really?" Henry asked, barely able to contain his excitement. Gloria held up a hand, her expression turning serious. "Yes, but with a new understanding between us. Our relationship, both personal and professional, must be based on mutual respect and shared values. Can you commit to that, Henry?" Henry didn't hesitate. "Absolutely, Ms. Thompson, I wholeheartedly agree," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I promise to carry the lessons I've learned with me in everything I do." Gloria stood up and extended her hand. "Then let's move forward together, Henry. I believe this partnership can do great things, not just for our businesses, but for our community as well." As Henry shook her hand, he felt a profound sense of relief and accomplishment. He knew this was more than just a business deal. It was the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one filled with empathy, understanding, and the desire to make a positive impact on the world around him. The partnership between Henry and Gloria's companies blossomed, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values. Their collaboration brought fresh perspectives to both businesses, leading to innovative solutions and increased success. Henry, true to his word, remained committed to his personal growth. He continued to volunteer at the orphanage, spending time with Malik and the other children whenever his schedule allowed. These visits served as a constant reminder of the importance of empathy and understanding in all aspects of life. Gloria noticed the positive changes in Henry's leadership style. He became more attentive to his employees' needs and concerns, fostering a more inclusive and supportive work environment. This shift not only improved morale, but also led to increased productivity and creativity within the company. As their partnership grew stronger, Henry began to take a more active role in Gloria's philanthropic efforts. He used his business acumen and resources to help expand the reach of her charitable projects. Together, they launched initiatives to provide educational opportunities for underprivileged youth and support small businesses in disadvantaged communities. One day, as they were discussing a new community outreach program, Henry turned to Gloria with a grateful smile. "You know, I never thought I'd say this, but that night at the restaurant was the best thing that could have happened to me," he admitted. Gloria nodded, her eyes twinkling. "Sometimes our greatest lessons come from our most difficult moments," she replied. "I'm proud of how far you've come, Henry." Henry's commitment to being a better person and leader didn't waver. He sought out opportunities to learn and grow, attending workshops on diversity and inclusion, and encouraging his employees to do the same. He became known not just for his business success, but for his integrity and compassion as well. As the months passed, Henry and Gloria's partnership became a model for ethical business practices in their industry. Their collaborative approach and focus on social responsibility attracted like-minded partners and clients, further strengthening their position in the market. The sun was setting as Henry, Gloria, and Marcus arrived at the orphanage for the annual charity event. The courtyard was decorated with colorful balloons and streamers, and the air buzzed with excitement from the children and volunteers alike. Henry felt a tug on his sleeve and looked down to see Malik grinning up at him. "You came," the boy exclaimed, his eyes shining with joy. "Of course I did, buddy," Henry replied, ruffling Malik's hair affectionately. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." As the evening progressed, Henry found himself surrounded by the children he had come to know and care for over the past months. They laughed together, shared stories, and played games. Gloria and Marcus watched from a distance, both touched by the genuine happiness